The orders arrived on a damp gray afternoon that smelled of wet canvas and diesel fumes. For Corporal Jimmy Carter, the crisp official paper felt heavier than any rifle he had ever shouldered. At 19, with the cobblestone streets of Chicago still a vivid memory, he now stood in a muddy field in Normandy, his world reduced to the rumble of distant artillery and the weight of the words before him. He was being assigned to the Red Ball Express. The name sounded almost cheerful, but the grim set of the sergeant's jaw told a different story. It was late, 1944, and the great Allied push after D-Day was starving for fuel, for ammunition, for everything. The front lines were a ravenous beast, and the Red Ball Express was its lifeline. He was joined by another soldier, a lanky private who introduced himself as Sam Jones with a slow Alabama drawl that seemed out of place amidst the clipped, urgent tones of the camp. Sam had a farmer's hands and a calm, easy-going demeanor that immediately put Jimmy's racing nerves at ease. Together, they were briefed in a tent, whose walls trembled with the constant movement outside. A harried officer pointed to a map, crisscrossed with thick red lines. He explained how General Patton's Third Army was driving east with breathtaking speed, but that speed came at a cost. Their tanks were running on fumes, their advance threatening to grind to a halt without the supplies Jimmy and Sam were now tasked with delivering. A cold knot of fear tightened in Jimmy's stomach. He had heard the stories, the snipers, the strafing runs from German planes, the treacherous bomb-cratered roads that served as their highway. This was not the infantry, but the danger was no less real. Yet, as he listened, a fierce, unexpected pride began to burn through the fear. Back in Chicago, he had been just another young black man, his opportunities limited by the color of his skin. Here, in this muddy field in France, he was a corporal in the United States Army, handed a mission critical to the fate of nations. He was part of something colossal, a vast, intricate machine, and his role, though seemingly small, was a vital cog. He looked at Sam, who gave a slow, confident nod, and in that silent exchange, a partnership was forged. They were not just drivers. They were the artery pumping blood to the heart of the fight, and the immense, terrifying responsibility of that role settled over Jimmy's shoulders as he folded his orders and prepared for the journey ahead. Nothing could have prepared Jimmy for the sight of the Normandy depot. The orderly rows of military tents and neat motor pools of his previous posting dissolved into a sprawling, roaring city of pure motion. The air itself vibrated with a percussive symphony of slamming tailgates, revving engines, and the shouted commands of dispatchers whose voices were frayed raw by urgency. Thousands of olive-drab GMC trucks, like a herd of massive restless beasts, were being fed their vital cargo. Mountains of wooden crates, stacks of artillery shells, and endless lines of jerrycans formed a landscape of organized chaos under the overcast sky. A dispatcher with a clipboard and a face etched with permanent exhaustion barely glanced at their papers before pointing a grimy finger toward a specific row. His instructions were a rapid-fire torrent, his eyes already scanning for the next driver in the endless line. He emphasized the red ball signs, the sacred markers that would guide their path, symbols of a route where stopping was not an option, and delay was a sin. The man's intensity was a physical force, pushing them forward into the maelstrom. Jimmy felt the scale of the operation press down on him, a dizzying wave of insignificance. He was one tiny piece in this vast, clattering machine, a single blood cell in an artery that stretched for hundreds of miles. The sheer volume of material, the frantic energy of thousands of men, all moving with a singular, desperate purpose, was overwhelming. For a moment, The pride he had felt upon receiving his orders wavered, threatening to be crushed beneath the weight of this logistical monster. Then he looked at Sam. The private from Alabama took in the scene with a practiced, calm assessment, his gaze methodical and unflustered. He nudged Jimmy gently, steering him toward their assigned truck, a hulking 6x6 that smelled of grease and damp canvas. The task was simple, physical, and grounding. They began loading the jerrycans, the heavy, sloshing containers of gasoline that were the lifeblood of Patton's tanks. Each can was a weight in his hands, a tangible piece of the responsibility he carried. The metallic clang as they set them into the truck bed was a counter-rhythm to the surrounding bedlam. Muscles began to burn and sweat stung his eyes, but with each jerrycan he lifted and secured, the overwhelming vastness of the depot receded. His world narrowed to the space between the stack of fuel and the bed of the truck, to the shared rhythm of the work with Sam. The determination that had flickered in the briefing tent now solidified into a hard, focused resolve. He was not just a cog, he was a bearer of flame, and he would carry it forward, no matter the chaos from which it came. The final jerrycan settled into the truck bed with a dull, resonant thud that seemed to seal a pact between them and the mission. Jimmy wiped the sweat from his brow with a greasy sleeve, his muscles singing a chorus of fatigue, but his spirit felt strangely light. The initial, overwhelming chaos of the depot had resolved into a personal, manageable task, and now, as they secured the canvas top over their precious cargo, the world around them came into sharper focus. Other drivers, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion, moved with the same weary purpose, a brotherhood forged in diesel and determination. A tall, broad-shouldered driver from a nearby truck gave them a slow, appreciative nod as he tightened his own load. "Straps." His name was Franklin, he said, his voice a deep rumble from Georgia. He had been running the Red Ball for weeks, a veteran of this relentless supply line. He shared a story of a night drive through a hail of shrapnel, the road lit by burning vehicles, his only guide the faint red reflectors of the truck ahead. Another man, younger with quick, nervous eyes, named Elijah, spoke of a blown tire on a narrow pass, the sheer drop into a ravine just inches away, and the frantic, shared effort to change it while the convoy snaked past. These were not tales of heroism, but of survival, of the small, critical victories that kept the lifeline flowing. Jimmy listened. His own fears mirrored and somehow diminished in the telling. He was not alone in his apprehension. It was the common currency of this place, and the sharing of it built a wall of solidarity against the looming dangers of the road. The easy camaraderie was pierced by the arrival of Sergeant Miller, his boots crunching on the gravel with an authority that silenced the murmured conversations. His gaze swept over their loaded truck, a quick, professional assessment, before settling on Jimmy and Sam. His words were not shouted, but they carried the weight of a hammer blow. He spoke of Patton's tanks, of the Third Army's spearhead currently stalled just miles from the German border, their engines silent, their guns useless without the fuel that now sat in their GMC. He described the men in those tanks, waiting, watching the skies, their advance hinging on the contents of this truck and the thousands like it. The sergeant's message was simple, its implications profound. This was not just a delivery. It was a race against the collapse of an entire offensive. The camaraderie Jimmy had felt moments before crystallized into something heavier, more profound, a shared burden of immense consequence. The weight of the jerrycans they had just loaded seemed to multiply, each one now representing a tank's worth of hope, a soldier's chance at survival. The depot, with its roaring engines and shouted orders, faded into a dull background. All that remained was the truck, the road, and the silent, waiting army at the end of it. The mission was no longer an abstract order. It was a tangible, crushing responsibility, and as Sergeant Miller moved on, his message lingering in the air like smoke, Jimmy felt the full, sobering weight of their duties settle deep into his bones. The first light of dawn was a pale, hesitant smear on the horizon, a weak promise in a sky still holding its breath. In the depot, that promise was answered by the thunderous, coordinated roar of 100 engines coughing to life at once. The sound was a physical wave that rolled through the crisp morning air, shaking the ground beneath Jimmy's boots as he settled into the driver's seat of the GMC. His hands, slick on the cool, hard plastic of the steering wheel, felt both alien and familiar. This was it. The planning, the loading, the waiting, all of it funneled into this single moment of motion. Beside him, Sam adjusted his cap, his movements economical and calm, a stark contrast to the frantic energy outside their cab. A dispatcher waved a green flag and the convoy began to creep forward, a slow, serpentine beast uncoiling itself onto the road. Jimmy eased the clutch, the truck lurching slightly before finding its rhythm, and they were moving, truly moving, leaving the organized chaos of the depot behind. The initial surge was one of pure, unadulterated excitement, a boyish thrill that made Jimmy's heart hammer against his ribs. He was driving into the war. That thrill was short-lived. The road out of Normandy was a testament to recent violence, a scar upon the earth. What had once been a thoroughfare was now a treacherous path of shattered asphalt and gaping craters, some filled with murky, rain-slicked water. The truck's suspension groaned and protested as Jimmy navigated the lunar landscape, his knuckles white as he wrestled the heavy vehicle around the deepest pits. The recent battles had not been distant echoes here. They were written into the very ground he drove upon. Sam, acting as navigator and seasoned guide, pointed out landmarks of destruction with a grim practicality. A shattered church spire, clawing at the sky like broken fingers. A burned-out farmhouse, its blackened skeleton, a stark silhouette against the lightning sky. He pointed to the mangled, rusting hulks of German equipment pushed to the roadside. A Panther tank with its turret blown clean off, the skeletal remains of a personnel carrier. Each one was a silent story of a violent end. Between these grim signposts, Sam offered a steady stream of driving tips, his voice a low, calming drone. He spoke of watching the truck ahead for sudden brake lights, of listening for the pitch of the engine on inclines, of conserving fuel by maintaining a steady, unflinching pace. His knowledge was a lifeline, and Jimmy clung to it. But as the sun finally broke free of the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows from the ruins, the initial excitement began to curdle. The reality of their task was no longer an abstract concept discussed in a tent or felt in the weight of a jerrycan. It was in the endless cratered road stretching before them, a road they would have to drive for hundreds of miles. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a cold, leaden feeling in the pit of Jimmy's stomach. This was not a brief, heroic dash. It was a grueling, dangerous marathon, and they had only just completed the first, sobering mile. The red ball signs became their silent, flickering companions, appearing like spectral guides at every junction and curve. Painted on scraps of wood and nailed to splintered fence posts, their crimson circles caught the weak morning light, a continuous thread pulling them deeper into the wounded French countryside. Each one was a confirmation, a small victory of navigation, in a landscape where all other landmarks spoke of endings. Jimmy's eyes, tired from the strain of navigating the cratered road, would lock onto each one, his focus narrowing to that bright splash of color before expanding again to take in the devastation it led them through. That devastation was relentless. They passed through a village that was no longer a village, just a collection of skeletal stone walls standing in fields of brick dust and splintered timber. The sharp, acrid smell of old fires and something fouler, something organic and final, seeped into the cab through the vents. A child's bicycle, twisted and rusted, lay half buried in the rubble near a shell-blasted tree, its presence a more profound indictment of the war than any destroyed tank. Jimmy's gaze lingered on it, and the weight of that cargo shifted in his mind. It was no longer just fuel. It was the substance of retaliation, the liquid anger needed to push this horror back, to ensure that no more bicycles were crushed under the treads of tyranny. Every jerrycan in the back was a promise to that ghostly village, a vow carried in a rumbling truck. The grim silence that had settled over him was broken by Sam's low, deliberate drawl. He began to tell a story, a tale from back in Alabama about the time he and his cousins tried to haul a stubborn mule named Jasper across a creek on a makeshift raft. The story was absurd, full of comic mishaps. The raft tipping, the mule's indignant braying, Sam getting tangled in fishing line and falling into the water. He painted the scene with such vivid, self-deprecating detail that the image of a furious, soaking wet mule and a sputtering young Sam began to overlay the grim scenery outside the window. Despite himself, a slow smile spread across Jimmy's face, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in miles. A rhythm established itself in the cab, a delicate balance between the sobering reality outside and the humanity preserved within. Sam's humor was a deliberate tool, a way to sand the sharp edges off their fear. He knew, as Jimmy was beginning to understand, that the challenges ahead were not just craters and broken bridges, but the slow, grinding weight of dread that could paralyze a man as surely as a bullet. By filling the air with the memory of a silly mule, he was fighting that dread, stitch by stitch. Jimmy took a firmer grip on the wheel, the truck humming steadily beneath him. The road was still long, the dangers very real, but for these few miles with the red bulbs flickering past, and Sam's story hanging in the air, they found a pace they could sustain. A small pocket of light moving steadily through the gathering dark. The world bled away into a deep, consuming indigo, the last vestiges of twilight swallowed by a moonless, starless sky. The comforting, familiar shapes of the French countryside dissolved into a formless void, leaving only the narrow ribbon of road ahead, a darker shade of black against the utter nothingness. The order came down the convoy, in hushed, urgent tones, passed from truck to truck like a secret. Jimmy's hand moved by rote, his fingers finding the small, shielded blackout lights on the dashboard. He flicked the switch, and their world shrank instantly. The powerful headlamps were extinguished, replaced by two slivers of faint blue light that barely illuminated the road 10 feet in front of their bumper. It was like trying to navigate a minefield while wearing a blindfold. The act of driving transformed from a task of concentration into one of pure, nerve-shredding instinct. The road, treacherous enough in daylight, became a predatory thing, its edges blurring into unseen ditches and its surface hiding new, terrifying imperfections. Jimmy leaned forward, his body tense, his spine pressed rigidly against the seat. His eyes strained until they ached, trying to wring every possible detail from the pathetic glow of the blackout lights. He followed the dim red tail lights of the truck ahead, like a sailor following a distant fading star, terrified that if he blinked, they would vanish and he would be lost forever in the dark. His heart became a frantic drum against his ribs, its rhythm dictated by every shadow that flickered at the edge of his vision. A gnarled, skeletal tree would loom suddenly, looking for one horrifying second like a man with a rifle. A ditch would appear as a yawning chasm. Every distant sound was amplified and distorted by the tense silence inside the cab. The low rumble of their own engine was a constant, but beneath it, from far away, came the deep-throated growl of artillery, a reminder that the war was not sleeping, only waiting. Each muffled thump sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through him, his hands tightening on the wheel until his knuckles were bone white. The fear of ambush was a cold, coiling serpent in his gut. The narrow, unlit roads were perfect for an enemy who knew the land, and every bend was a potential trigger for muzzle flashes and the shriek of incoming fire. He imagined German soldiers hidden in the hedgerows, their eyes adjusted to the dark, watching the slow, vulnerable procession of dim blue lights. He and Sam barely spoke, their communication reduced to sharp, hissed warnings. Left a little, Sam would murmur, his own gaze fixed on the passenger side darkness. "Crater, right side." The shared tension was a physical presence in the cab, thick and suffocating. There was no room for Sam's stories now. No space for humor or reflection. There was only the dark, the treacherous road, and the pounding primal fear that kept their senses razor-sharp and their bodies coiled, ready for a violence that could erupt from the shadows at any moment. They were no longer just drivers on a mission. They were prey, moving with hell breath through a hunter's moonless night. The first sign of the checkpoint was not a structure, but a sudden, jarring compression of the convoy. The steady, rumbling rhythm of the Red Ball Express, a pace Jimmy's nerves had finally begun to accept, fractured into a series of lurches and halts. Up ahead, the snake of taillights, which had been a comforting guide through the oppressive darkness, coagulated into a dense, glowing red eye. The trucks ahead of them slowed to a crawl, their engines groaning in protest at the interruption. A low curse escaped Sam's lips, a soft, frustrated sound that was swallowed by the idling rumble of their own engine. As they crept forward, the checkpoint materialized from the gloom. It was a pocket of harsh, unwelcome order carved from the night's chaos. Two jeeps were parked at oblique angles, their headlights blazing, creating a stark island of illumination that felt both exposed and confining. In the center of this manufactured daylight stood 3 military policemen, their postures rigid, their white leggings and brassards glowing like beacons. They moved with a cold, methodical efficiency that was a world away from the frantic urgency of the depot or the shared tension of the convoy. This was bureaucracy, at the razor's edge of a war zone. Their turn came. Jimmy brought the GMC to a stop, the squeal of the brakes unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. One of the MPs, a corporal with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, approached Jimmy's window. His eyes, pale and devoid of warmth, scanned the cab before he uttered a single clipped word. "Papers." Jimmy's hands, still trembling slightly from the strain of the night drive, fumbled in his tunic pocket, producing the folded orders and his identification. The MP took them without a word, his gaze shifting to Sam, who handed over his own documents with a quiet, resigned efficiency. The inspection felt interminable. The MP spent an agonizingly long time scrutinizing each line of their orders, his lips moving silently as he read. He compared their faces to the photos on their IDs with a suspicion that felt personal. Meanwhile, another MP, a private with a rifle slung over his shoulder, circled the truck, his boot heels crunching on the gravel. He rapped his knuckles against the jerrycans in the back, the hollow thuds a questioning percussion. He tugged at the rope securing the top, testing their knots with a dismissive tug. Every second that ticked by was a grain of sand slipping through an hourglass, each one a mile not driven. a gallon of fuel not delivered to the waiting tanks at the front. The tension in the cab became a suffocating blanket. Jimmy's frustration began to simmer, hot and acidic, in his chest. They had navigated cratered roads and driven through a terrifying blackout, all to be halted by this man with a clipboard and an attitude. He watched the MP's impassive face, the slow, deliberate turn of a page, and felt a surge of impotent anger. This was the lifeline for Patton's army, and it was being delayed by paperwork. The bureaucratic ritual, so utterly disconnected from the desperate reality of their mission, felt like a profound absurdity. A dangerous game played while men waited for the fuel that could mean the difference between life and death. The MP finally looked up from the papers, his cold eyes fixing on Jimmy, and the air in the cab went still, heavy with the unspoken question of whether this pointless delay would become something worse. The MP's granite face finally cracked with a minuscule, almost imperceptible nod. He handed their papers back through the window with a curt "Proceed," then turned his cold attention to the next truck in line, already dismissing them from his world. Jimmy let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the air shuddering from his lungs as he carefully eased the clutch and guided the GMC back onto the dark road. The truck lurched forward, rejoining the slow, resuming flow of the convoy, but the fragile rhythm of the night had been shattered. The frustration that had simmered in his chest during the inspection now boiled over, hot and bitter. He voiced his anger in a low, tight stream, his words directed at the windshield and the retreating glow of the checkpoint. He cursed the delay, the pointless scrutiny, the MPs who seemed more concerned with perfect paperwork than with the urgent, sloshing cargo in their truck. Every minute spent stationary under those glaring Jeep lights was a minute stolen from the front, a minute Patton's tanks remained silent. It felt like a betrayal of the very urgency Sergeant Miller had burned into them back at the depot. Sam listened in silence for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the dim red taillights ahead. When he finally spoke, his Alabama drawl was calm and measured, a steadying counterweight to Jimmy's frayed nerves. He explained that the MPs were the gatekeepers, the ones who tried to impose a fragile order onto the chaos of the supply line. Their job was to root out saboteurs, to catch deserters, to ensure that the wrong vehicles or the wrong people didn't slip through to the front. He described checkpoints that had indeed uncovered German infiltrators disguised as American drivers, or trucks carrying explosives instead of rations. The delay, Sam said, was the price of security, a necessary friction in the desperate race to keep the army moving. The explanation did not erase the lost time, but it reframed it, sanding the sharp edges of Jimmy's anger. He fell silent, his hands relaxing their death grip on the steering wheel as Sam's words settled in his mind. He looked out at the dark, menacing landscape, and for the first time he saw it not just as a physical obstacle of craters and ambushes, but as a system of vast, fragile, and incredibly complex machine. The depot loaders, the dispatchers, the mechanics in their support trucks, the MPs at their checkpoints, they were all interconnected parts. A single failure in security could be as catastrophic as a broken axle. The 15 minutes lost at the checkpoint were no longer just an infuriating bureaucratic delay. They were a tiny, tangible example of the countless frictions and inefficiencies that plagued the entire operation. Every pothole, every mechanical sputter, every moment of questioning by a suspicious MP, all of it accumulated, creating a drag on the entire advance. Jimmy's understanding of the mission deepened, expanding beyond his own truck and his own fears. He was part of an immense, straining organism, and every second counted, not just for him, but for the entire desperate push east. The frustration faded, replaced by a sober, grim acceptance. The road ahead was not just a test of driving skill or courage. It was a test of an entire system's endurance, and he was now acutely aware of how his own small role and every delay within it sent ripples all the way to the silent guns at the front. The first cough from the engine was a small, almost apologetic sound, easily dismissed as a hiccup in the GMC's steady, rumbling song. Jimmy's foot instinctively pressed a little harder on the accelerator, a futile attempt to push past the momentary weakness. But a second later, the truck gave a violent, shuddering lurch, a deep, guttural sputter that rattled the entire chassis and sent a jolt of pure alarm straight up Jimmy's spine. The power drained from the engine as if a vital artery had been severed. The steady vibration that had been a constant companion through the long, dark hours faltered, then faded into a sickly, uneven chugging. The speedometer needle, which had held so resolutely at 35, began a slow, inexorable slide backward. Panic, cold and immediate, flooded the cab. It was a taste of copper on the tongue, a sudden constriction in the chest. Jimmy's hands wrestled with the steering wheel as the heavy vehicle, losing its momentum, began to drift toward the soft, dark shoulder of the road. He could hear the frustrated blare of a horn from the truck behind them, a sound of communal annoyance that quickly faded as the convoy, an unthinking entity, flowed around their stricken vehicle. They were an obstruction, a sudden stone in the river, and the river simply parted and moved on. The sight of those other taillights receding into the darkness, leaving them alone in a pocket of silence broken only by the truck's dying gasps, was a feeling of profound and terrifying isolation. Sam was already moving, his calm a stark contrast to the frantic thumping of Jimmy's heart. "Coast it over? Coast it over," he said, his voice low and urgent. Jimmy guided the limping truck as far off the road as he dared, the tires crunching on gravel before sinking slightly into the damp earth. The engine gave one last wet-sounding sigh and fell silent. The sudden quiet was deafening, a void filled only by the receding rumble of the convoy and the frantic chirping of crickets that seemed to mock their predicament. Jimmy sat for a moment, his hand still locked on the wheel, staring into the impenetrable blackness beyond their useless blackout lights. His mind raced, tripping over terrifying possibilities. Sabotage, a sniper's lucky shot. His thoughts flew forward, down the Red Ball route, to the front lines, where men were counting on them. Every minute they sat here was a minute. The fuel didn't arrive, a minute a tank couldn't move, a minute a soldier might die for want of the gasoline that was now so tantalizingly close, yet utterly stranded. The weight of their cargo, which had felt like pride hours ago, now felt like an anchor, chaining them to this spot and failing the very men they were meant to support. He was pulled from his spiraling thoughts by the squeal of the hood latch. Sam was out of the cab, a small flashlight in his hand, its beam a brave, narrow sword against the overwhelming dark. Jimmy scrambled out after him, the cool night air doing nothing to cool the fever of his anxiety. Sam was already peering into the engine bay, the flashlight playing over the intricate, greasy landscape of the engine. He leaned in, his nose wrinkling at the smell of hot metal and oil. He tapped a component, then traced a fuel line with his finger. After a long, tense moment, he straightened up, his face grim in the flashlight's back glow. "Fuel pump, maybe," he said, his voice flat. "Or a clogged line. She's not getting what she needs." The diagnosis was simple, but in the darkness, on a deserted road, miles from help, it sounded like a death sentence for their mission. The beam of Sam's flashlight trembled slightly as he traced the fuel line, a lone, probing eye in the vast, indifferent dark. Jimmy's own despair was a cold stone in his gut, his mind already calculating the hours they would lose. the consequences rippling all the way to the stalled tanks at the front. The silence around them felt heavy, accusatory, broken only by the distant, fading growl of the convoy that had left them behind. Then, a new sound pierced the night, a deeper, more purposeful engine rumble, growing steadily louder from the direction they had come. A pair of pinprick blackout lights emerged from the gloom, resolving into the boxy shape of a mechanic's truck, its canvas sides flapping like weary wings. It slowed and pulled to a halt behind their stricken GMC, a miracle on wheels. A soldier hopped out with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. Private Davis, according to the grimy patch on his coveralls, had a face smudged with grease and eyes that held a calm, appraising intelligence. He gave a curt nod, his gaze sweeping from their anxious faces to the open hood. He didn't waste words. He asked Sam what he'd found, listened to the theory of a fuel pump or clogged line, and gave a grunt of acknowledgement. Then he was at the engine, his own powerful flashlight joining Sam's. His hands, though stained black with oil, moved with a surgeon's precision, probing, testing, and feeling. Within minutes, he had isolated the problem. It wasn't the pump, but a clogged fuel filter, choked with sediment from the dubious quality of the gasoline they were forced to use. Davis explained the issue in short, clipped sentences as he worked, his voice a steady, instructional drone. Jimmy and Sam became his impromptu assistants, holding lights, fetching tools from his well-ordered truck, and passing the specific wrenches he called for. Davis worked with a spare part pulled from his own extensive inventory, his movements swift and certain. He showed them how to bleed the air from the line after replacing the filter, a crucial step Jimmy would never have known. The lesson was imparted not in a classroom, but in the cold, dark reality of a French roadside, the stakes of the knowledge immeasurably high. The whole operation took less than 20 minutes. Davis gave the fuel line a final tap, wiped his hands on a rag, and nodded toward the cab. "Give her a crank." Jimmy slid behind the wheel, his heart in his throat. He turned the key. The engine coughed once, sputtered, and then roared to life with a healthy, powerful rumble. That was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. The relief that washed over him was so profound, it felt like a physical warmth, thawing the cold knot of fear that had gripped him. As they pulled back onto the road, their headlights catching the reassuring red ball on the back of Davis's truck as he sped off to his next emergency, Jimmy looked over at Sam. No words were needed. The shared experience, the panic, the isolation, and the swift, professional salvation had forged a new layer to their bond. They were not just two drivers in a truck. They were part of a vast, mobile support network, a brotherhood that stretched all the way back to the depots and forward to the front. The camaraderie of the Red Ball Express was not just about shared danger, but about shared reliance. They drove on into the night, the GMC humming contentedly, their gratitude for men like Davis and the intricate web of support they represented, settling around them like a shield, strengthening their resolve for the miles yet to come. The darkness did not so much lift as it curdled, the deep black of night slowly leaching away into a thick, oppressive gray that swallowed the world, whole. Dawn arrived not with light, but with a suffocating blanket of fog that rolled in from the low-lying fields, a cold, wet phantom that erased everything beyond the hood of the GMC. The road ahead, the ditches to either side, the skeletal trees that had been their grim companions, all of it vanished into a swirling, formless murk. The dim red taillights of the truck they had been following for hours dissolved into a faint, blurry smudge, then disappeared entirely. leaving them utterly alone in a universe of featureless gray. The world had been reduced to the 10 feet of wet asphalt visible through the windshield and the low, anxious rumble of their own engine. Jimmy leaned forward until his forehead was almost touching the cold glass, his eyes straining against the impossible whiteness. He drove by, feel as much as by sight, his senses hyper-attuned to the subtle vibrations of the tires on the road's edge, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The speedometer needle hovered just above 5 miles per hour, a crawl that felt both dangerously fast and agonizingly slow. Every instinct screamed at him to stop, to wait for the fog to burn off, but the ghost of Sergeant Miller's voice echoed in his mind, reminding him that stopping was not an option. Patton's tanks did not run on patience. In the passenger seat, Sam had transformed from navigator to a second set of eyes, his body tense as he peered into the void on his side. His voice, usually a calm drawl, was now a series of tight, urgent commands, a verbal map of a world they could no longer see. Easing left, just a touch, he would murmur, his hand making the slight turning motion in the air. Feel that? The crown of the road. Keep to it. Jimmy obeyed without question, his entire being focused on the sound of Sam's voice, the only tether they had to direction and safety. Sam's instructions were based on memory, on the feel of the road beneath them, on the faintest of shadows in the milky haze. He was building a path out of nothing, and Jimmy was blindly following, his trust in his partner absolute. The tension in the cab was a taut wire, humming with a silent, shared dread. The eerie, absolute silence of the fog was more unnerving than the roar of artillery or the blare of convoy horns. It was a dead, muffled quiet, broken only by the swish of their own tires on the wet road and the frantic beating of their hearts. It was a silence that felt watchful, that seemed to hide 1,000 unseen threats in its depths. They were exposed and blind, a single noisy heartbeat in a vast white silence. Then it happened. Sam, squinting hard, saw the faintest, darkest hint of a shape to their right, a fraction of a second too late. "Turn, hard right," he barked, his voice sharp with alarm. Jimmy jerked the wheel, the heavy truck swaying dangerously on the slick road. For one heart-stopping moment, the front tires slipped onto the soft, muddy shoulder, the chassis groaning in protest. Jimmy fought the skid, his muscles burning, guiding the massive vehicle back onto the solid pavement. As they straightened out, the vague shape resolved into a splintered post, and just beyond it, the faint, ghostly outline of a red ball sign marking a sharp turn they had nearly missed entirely. They had corrected in time, but the near disaster left them both breathing in ragged, shallow gasps, the adrenaline a sour taste in their mouths. They drove on, the close call having stretched their nerves to a razor's edge. The fog did not relent. If anything, it seemed to grow thicker, a cold, damp shroud that clung to the windshield and seeped into their bones. The journey was no longer just about distance or danger from the enemy. It was a psychological trial, a battle against a formless, suffocating enemy that robbed them of sight and sound, leaving them with nothing but their own fear and a fragile, vital thread of trust between them, to guide their way through the blinding silent white. The first crack of gunfire was a distant, brittle sound, like a twig snapping somewhere far behind a curtain of fog. It was almost lost beneath the rumble of their engine and the swish of tires on wet road, but it was a sound that needed no repetition to be understood. It was a key turning in a lock, opening a door to a different kind of fear. A second shot followed, closer this time, its sharp report echoing flatly in the damp air, and then a short, stuttering burst of automatic fire. that erased any last doubt. The war, which had been a landscape of past destruction and distant thunder, had just found their coordinates. The convoy reacted as a single organism, sensing a predator. The steady, crawling pace they had maintained through the fog fractured instantly. Up ahead, brake lights bloomed like sudden bloody flowers in the gloom, as trucks ground to a halt. The orderly line dissolved into a confused, overlapping snake of vehicles, drivers jockeying for position, not to advance, but to find cover. The low, urgent murmur of the convoy was pierced by sharper, hissed commands from the NCOs, who materialized from the mist, their faces tight. Words were passed from cab to cab, a chilling whisper slithering down the line. Infiltrators. Ambush. Jimmy's hands, which had been locked in a white-knuckled grip on the wheel to navigate the fog, began to tremble. It was a fine, uncontrollable vibration that started in his fingers and traveled up his arms, a physical manifestation of the cold dread solidifying in his gut. He guided the GMC off the road, the tires sinking into the soft, wet earth of a drainage ditch, tucking the massive vehicle in behind the bulk of a deuce and a half that had stopped ahead of them. The truck became not a vehicle of delivery, but a hunk of metal to hide behind, its cargo of volatile fuel now feeling less like a lifeline and more like a bomb. The world narrowed to the confines of the cab. The fog, which moments before had been a terrifying blindness, now felt like a fragile shield, hiding them as well as it hid the enemy. Every sense was heightened to an almost painful acuity. Jimmy could hear the ragged sound of his own breathing, the frantic thumping of his heart a drumbeat in his ears. He strained to listen past these internal noises, his head cocked, trying to parse the sounds from the whiteness. The rustle of a wet branch was a soldier's footstep. The drip of water from a leaf was the cocking of a rifle. His eyes, wide and unblinking, scanned the shifting gray wall outside the windshield, his mind painting terrifying pictures onto the blank canvas, the shape of a helmet, the glint of a scope, the sudden orange flower of a muzzle flash. Time stretched and warped in the tense silence. Minutes felt like hours. They were trapped in a dreadful limbo, caught between the need to move and the terror of what moving might bring. The rumors that had spread through the convoy now echoed in his mind, each one more terrifying than the last. They were sitting ducks, a long, vulnerable line of fuel and ammunition, waiting for a scout they couldn't see to give a signal they might not live to hear. All they could do was wait, hearts pounding, hands trembling on cold plastic and steel, as the fog and the silence and the unseen enemy pressed in from all sides. The wait was an eternity measured in hammering heartbeats and the slow, cold seep of dread. Each second was a taut wire stretched to its breaking point. The silence in the cab so profound Jimmy could hear the faint, gritty sound of Sam's thumb rubbing back and forth against the stock of his rifle. The fog remained, a conspirator in the tension, its swirling gray folds hiding everything and promising anything. Then a new sound cut through the stillness. Not a gunshot, but the low, guttural rumble of a Jeep engine approaching from ahead. It moved slowly, deliberately, and soon the shadowy forms of two American scouts materialized from the mist, their faces grim and streaked with mud. They moved down the line of trucks, their voices low but clear as they delivered the all clear. The German patrol, they reported, had been a small, probing force, already engaged and driven off by a unit further down the road. The immediate threat was over. A collective, shuddering sigh seemed to pass through the entire convoy. Engines coughed back to life, a sound more hesitant and weary than before. Jimmy's own hands were still unsteady as he shifted the GMC into gear, guiding it back onto the scarred pavement. They proceeded, but the character of the journey had irrevocably shifted. The caution they had practiced before was now a deep, ingrained hypervigilance. Every shadow in the receding fog was scrutinized, every distant sound analyzed. Jimmy's eyes constantly scanned the hedgerows and tree lines, his foot hovering near the brake, his body coiled like a spring. The red ball signs, once symbols of purpose, now felt like targets. The adrenaline that had sustained them during the wait drained away, leaving behind a hollow, jangling exhaustion. Jimmy's shoulders ached with a tension that had settled deep into the muscle, and a cold tremor still ran intermittently through his hands. The nearness of the enemy, the tangible proof that death could step out of the mist at any moment, had left a mark on his spirit. He felt stripped raw. The professional soldier's composure he had been cultivating shattered to reveal the frightened 19-year-old underneath. Sam, sensing the shift in his partner, let the silence stretch for a mile before he spoke. His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual easygoing cadence. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false bravado. Instead, he shared his own fear, the cold, gripping terror he had felt back in the fog. The image of his wife's face that had flashed behind his eyes when the first shots rang out. He spoke of the vulnerability, of feeling like a mouse in a field waiting for the hawk to strike. His confession was not a weakness but a gift. It was an acknowledgement that the fear was real, that it was shared, and that it did not make them any less capable of doing their jobs. His words were a balm. Jimmy felt the tight knot in his chest begin to loosen. He wasn't alone in his fear. It was the silent passenger in every truck in the convoy. Sam's honesty reframed their shaken nerves not as a failure of courage, but as a testament to their humanity. They were not unfeeling machines, but men doing an impossible job under the constant shadow of violence. As the last tendrils of fog burned away under a weak sun, revealing the war-torn landscape once more, Jimmy took a long, steadying breath. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was now joined by a renewed, gritty determination. They had stared into the abyss of an ambush and had not been swallowed. They had been shaken, but they were still moving. His hands steadied on the wheel, and he pressed the accelerator, the truck surging forward with a purpose that felt harder, more earned and more resilient than before. The road ahead was still dangerous, but they would meet it not as boys on an adventure, but as soldiers who knew the precise cost of every mile. The grim, war-torn landscape of shattered trees and cratered fields began to soften, giving way to the first signs of a life that had stubbornly refused to be entirely extinguished. A low stone wall, still mostly intact, ran alongside the road. Beyond it, the earth showed the neat, cultivated rows of a kitchen garden, a defiant patch of order amidst the chaos. Then the village itself appeared, not as a ruin, but as a cluster of stone cottages nestled in a shallow valley, their slate roofs glistening damply in the hazy midday light. It was a place that had been brushed by the war's passing, not crushed by it. A few windows were boarded up, and pockmarks from stray bullets scarred some of the older walls, but its heart was still beating. As the convoy rumbled slowly through the single narrow street, a subtle transformation occurred. Doors, which had likely been shut and barred against the violence of the recent past, began to creak open. Figures emerged, hesitant at first, then more confident, spilling out into the sunlight. They were the civilians, The people for whom all the grand strategies and desperate supply runs were ultimately intended. Old men with faces like wrinkled parchment stood in their doorways, their hands raised in solemn, grateful waves. Women in faded dresses, their hair tied back in scarves, watched from the thresholds, their expressions a complex tapestry of relief, wariness, and hope. They did not cheer. Their welcome was quieter, more profound, a silent acknowledgement of the lifeline rumbling past their homes. And then there were the children. A small group of them, their earlier caution forgotten, darted to the edge of the road, their small hands waving frantically, their faces alight with a curiosity that transcended nationality and conflict. From this group, a single figure broke away. A young girl no more than 7 or 8, with large, serious eyes and 2 blonde braids, took a few tentative steps towards the slowing trucks. Clutched in her hands was a small wooden basket, its contents hidden by a checkered cloth. Her eyes scanned the line of anonymous, dust-caked vehicles until they landed on Jimmy and Sam's GMC. With a sudden, decisive burst of courage, she ran forward, her small feet pattering on the cobblestones. She stopped just beside Jimmy's window, her head barely reaching the bottom of the door. She didn't smile, but her gaze was direct and unwavering. She held up the basket, lifting the cloth to reveal a small pile of apples. Their skins a bright, impossible green against the drab olive of the truck and the gray of Ive. "The road," she said, a single word, her voice clear and bell-like over the idle of the engine. Marie. It was an offering, a name, a moment of pure, unadulterated humanity extended across the chasm of war. Jimmy, whose world had been reduced for so long to the rumble of the engine, the tension of the road, and the cold weight of fear, felt something shift deep inside him. The carefully constructed shell of the soldier, the focus driver, cracked. He looked down at the girl, at her earnest face, and her simple, profound gift, and the immense, abstract machinery of the war, the depots, the checkpoints, the fuel gauges. The unseen enemy fell away. In that moment, it was not about Patton or the Third Army or the grand sweep of history. It was about this one child in this one village offering an apple to a stranger in a truck. It was a connection, fragile and beautiful, a reminder of the world they were fighting to preserve, a world of gardens and braided hair and simple kindness. He reached down, his own large grease-stained hand looking clumsy and immense next to her small one, and took an apple. His quiet "thank you" was swallowed by the engine's noise, but she seemed to understand. She gave a small, solemn nod before turning and darting back to the safety of the other children. Jimmy held the fruit, its cool, smooth surface, a stark contrast to the gritty, vibrating reality of the truck. He looked over at Sam, who had taken an apple of his own and was turning it over in his hand, a slow, thoughtful smile touching his lips. No words were needed. The simple, tangible gift had momentarily lifted the heavy shroud of the mission, bathing their spirits in a warm, unexpected light. For a few precious seconds, as the convoy began to move forward and the villagers waved them on their way, they were not just soldiers in a war. They were men, connected by a shared thread of humanity to the very people they were sworn to protect, and the weight of their cargo felt a little lighter, their purpose a little brighter, on the long, hard road ahead. The slow, inexorable descent of the needle was a thief in the cab, stealing the brief warmth left by the memory of the French village. Jimmy's eyes, which had been scanning the road with a renewed if weary vigilance, flicked down to the instrument panel out of habit. The action was as automatic as breathing, a constant, subconscious check on the truck's vitals. This time, however, his gaze did not slide away. It stuck, frozen, on the fuel gauge. The needle, which should have been hovering comfortably above the halfway mark, had instead crept deep into the red, its tip hovering just a hair's breadth above the empty pin. A cold, sharp spike of anxiety, far more immediate than the fear of ambush, lanced through him. He didn't speak at first, his mind refusing to accept the evidence of his own eyes. They had loaded the jerrycans themselves, counted them, secured them. The GMC had a massive tank designed for distance. It was impossible. He tapped the glass face of the gauge with a grimy fingernail, a superstitious gesture hoping to jolt the needle back to a sane position. It didn't move. The reality of their situation crashed down upon him with the force of a physical blow. They were burning through their lifeblood, and the well was nearly dry. His sharp, indrawn breath was all the warning Sam needed. Sam leaned over, his own eyes narrowing as he took in the damning position of the needle. The easygoing demeanor he had maintained through fog and enemy fire evaporated, replaced by a grim, focused intensity. The map was pulled from its cubbyhole with a frantic rustle, unfolding across their knees in a crackle of paper. Their heads bent together over the creased lines and topographic markings, their world shrinking to the distance between 2 points. Sam's grease-stained finger traced their route, his lips moving silently as he calculated miles, his brow furrowed in concentration. The next designated fuel depot was a stark, terrifying number of miles away, a distance that felt continental in its scope. The math was simple, brutal, and unforgiving. The numbers did not add up. A silent, desperate communication passed between them, a conversation of widened eyes and clenched jaws. There was no decision to be made, only a single grim course of action. Jimmy's foot, which had been pressing for every ounce of speed the lumbering truck could offer, now eased back on the accelerator. The deep-throated roar of the engine softened to a strained, economical purr as their speed bled away. They dropped from the pace of the convoy, falling back through the line of trucks like a wounded animal lagging behind the herd. Other drivers, sensing their trouble, gave them a wide berth, their faces a mix of sympathy and relief that it was not them. Every rotation of the tires now felt measured, each one consuming a precious, finite drop of the fuel that was their only tether to the mission. The tension in the cab became a thick, suffocating fog of its own making, far worse than the one that had blinded them at dawn. It was a slow, grinding dread, a race against an invisible clock, whose ticking was the steady, sickeningly slow descent of the needle. Jimmy's eyes flicked from the road to the gauge and back again, a frantic, metronomic dance of hope and despair. The red ball signs they passed no longer promised a path to the front. They now marked a countdown to failure, each one a mocking reminder of the miles yet to travel, and the empty tank that threatened to silence their journey for good. The GMC, once a symbol of power and purpose, now felt like a fragile shell, its vibrant hum a fading heartbeat, carrying them forward on a prayer and the dwindling vapors of hope. The road, which had been a winding but passable ribbon through the French countryside, began to funnel downward following the course of a sluggish, brown river that carved a deep scar through the land. It was there, at the bottom of the gentle slope, that the lifeline of the Red Ball Express met its next, most literal bottleneck. The bridge was a mangled skeleton of stone and steel, a testament to the thoroughness of retreating German engineers or the accuracy of Allied bombers. The cause didn't matter, only the effect. One entire side of the structure had been sheared away, collapsing into the river below in a chaotic tumble of broken masonry and twisted rebar. The remaining half stood precariously, a lone wounded arc spanning the water, its surface reduced to a single, terrifyingly narrow lane. The convoy, which had been moving with a strained but steady purpose, compressed into a tangled, groaning beast of frustration. The line of trucks stretched back up the hill and out of sight, a motionless river of olive-drab steel. Engines idled in a discordant chorus of impatience, their exhaust fumes collecting in a low blue haze that hung over the river valley. The air, once filled with the roar of progress, was now thick with the smell of diesel and the palpable tension of men whose urgency was being throttled by cold, hard reality. At the mouth of the shattered bridge, a scene of controlled chaos unfolded. Two military policemen, their faces set in masks of weary authority, stood like beleaguered traffic conductors in the center of a storm. They directed the flow with sharp, whistled signals and curt hand gestures, their voices hoarse from shouting. One lane of traffic, a trickle of vehicles coming from the other direction, had to be stopped completely to allow the Red Ball convoy its turn. Each truck, as it was waved forward, would creep onto the damaged span. With agonizing slowness, its wheels carefully aligned with the center of the remaining roadway, mere inches from the jagged edge that dropped away into the churning water below. Jimmy brought their GMC to a halt in the long stationary line, the truck's engine ticking as it cooled. His earlier anxiety about the fuel gauge was now subsumed by this new, more immediate obstacle. He watched the slow-motion ballet on the bridge, his stomach clenching with a sympathetic dread for each driver who attempted the crossing. A heavy transport truck laden with artillery shells seemed to hold its breath as it inched across, its suspension groaning under the weight, its outside tires dusting the very lip of the precipice. The driver's face, visible for a moment through the windshield, was a pale, rigid mask of concentration. Jimmy's own hands tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. He could feel the immense, precarious weight of their own cargo, the sloshing jerrycans of fuel that would turn their truck into a fireball if it so much as scraped the side or lost its grip on the crumbling edge. The weight was a torture, each minute a grain of sand in an hourglass they could not afford to flip. The narrow bridge ahead not just a physical challenge, but a gauntlet of fate thrown down directly in the path of their desperate, dwindling mission. The MP's sharp whistle cut through the diesel-laden air, a piercing signal that was both a command and a condemnation. It was their turn. The soldier pointed directly at their GMC, his gesture leaving no room for hesitation or debate. The truck ahead of them, having successfully navigated the gauntlet, was now a shrinking shape on the far bank, and the void it left behind was a chasm of expectation. Jimmy's mouth went dry as dust. He exchanged a single, grim look with Sam, whose slow nod was all the confirmation he needed. There was no going back. The fragile bridge, with its single wounded lane and its promise of a sheer drop, was now their only path forward. Jimmy eased the clutch, and the GMC crept forward, its heavy tires crunching over the scattered gravel and broken stone that littered the approach. The world seemed to narrow, telescoping down to the width of the bridge and the brown, churning water far below. As the front tires met, the stonework of the span itself, a different sound echoed up from the chassis, a hollow, resonant drumming that spoke of the emptiness beneath them. He guided the truck with a delicacy that felt alien to the vehicle's brutish nature, his hands making micro-adjustments, his entire being focused on keeping the massive vehicle centered on the crumbling roadway. The outside mirror showed a terrifying vista of nothingness, a sheer drop to the river where the other half of the bridge should have been. Then, the engine groaned. It was a deep, protesting sound that vibrated through the entire truck, a guttural complaint from a machine pushed to its absolute limit. The incline of the damaged arch, slight though it was, combined with the immense weight of the fuel in the back, was too much. The RPMs plummeted. The truck shuddered, a great weary beast on the verge of collapse. For one heart-stopping second, the engine sputtered, the power fading as if the fuel lines had been cut. They were stalling, freezing in the middle of the bridge, becoming the very obstruction they had dreaded. Jimmy's foot stumped on the clutch, his other jamming the accelerator to the floor, a frantic, unspoken prayer on his lips. The engine roared in protest, a blast of black smoke erupting from the exhaust, and the truck lurched forward, finding a tenuous grip on the stone and crawling upward once more. The seconds it took to cross the rest of the bridge were an eternity. Each inch of progress, of victory, wrested from gravity and fate. Jimmy didn't breathe until the front tires met the solid, welcoming earth of the far bank. He guided the truck clear, his arms trembling with the aftermath of the strain, and pulled over to the shoulder. For a long moment, they just sat there, the only sound their own ragged breathing, and the steady, blessed rumble of the idling engine. The relief that washed over them was a physical tide, so potent it felt like a new kind of exhaustion, leaching the tension from their muscles and leaving them boneless and spent. But the respite was brief. Behind them, the next truck was already beginning its own perilous crossing, a reminder that the convoy's relentless momentum waited for no one. Jimmy put the GMC back into gear, and they pulled onto the road, leaving the narrow bridge and its specter of disaster behind. The landscape opened up again, but the easy rhythm of the earlier journey was gone, replaced by a grim, hard-won awareness. They had conquered one obstacle, but the memory of the groaning engine and the dizzying drop was seared into their minds. The road ahead was long, their fuel was low, and they were now acutely, painfully aware that the next challenge could be waiting around any bend, another gauntlet thrown down by a war that tested men and machines to their absolute breaking point. They drove on, the relief already hardening into a layer of resilience, their resolve tempered in the fire of the narrow bridge. The sky, which had been a flat, oppressive gray for hours, finally broke. It did not weep, but unleashed a torrent, a savage, drumming downpour that hammered against the GMC's canvas roof with the force of 1,000 tiny fists. In minutes, the world dissolved into a monochrome nightmare of water and earth. The road, already scarred and fragile, surrendered completely. The hard-packed gravel and patches of asphalt disappeared under a slick, churning river of mud that grasped at the tires with a greedy, sucking hunger. The Red Ball Express, a mighty artery of steel and purpose, was slowing to a viscous, struggling crawl, its progress measured in inches and curses. Inside the cab, the drumming of the rain was a deafening roar, drowning out the engine and any attempt at conversation. Jimmy fought the steering wheel, his entire body a single, straining cable of effort. The truck was no longer a machine to be guided, but a rebellious, half-wild beast trying to wrench itself from his control. The back end would slither sideways without warning, the tires losing all purchase in the liquid earth, sending the heavy vehicle into a sickening, slow-motion skid toward the deep ditches that lined the road. Each time Jimmy would wrestle it back, his shoulders and arms burning with a deep, fiery ache. His jaw clenched so tight, his teeth threatened to crack. The constant, brutal corrections were a physical battle, draining his strength and fraying his nerves to their very ends. His world shrank to the few feet of muddy chaos visible through the frantic, ineffective swipes of the windshield wipers. The red tail lights of the truck ahead were blurred, watery smears, their distance a terrifying variable in the equation of collision and control. His knuckles were white bone against the dark plastic of the wheel, his muscles screaming in protest with every lurch and slide. The initial determination that had carried him through fog and enemy fire was being eroded, replaced by a grinding, exhausting frustration. He was a boxer in the 12th round, arms leaden, barely able to keep his guard up against an opponent that was the very ground beneath him. He didn't notice the subtle shift at first, his focus locked on the battle with the road. It was a light touch on his forearm, a firm, calming pressure that cut through the haze of his exertion. He turned his head, his neck stiff to see Sam looking at him, his expression not of panic, but of weary assessment. Sam's eyes flicked from Jimmy's strained face to his white-knuckled hands, then back to the treacherous road. He didn't speak. The roar of the rain made it pointless. Instead, he made a simple, deliberate gesture, pointing 2 fingers from his own chest to the steering wheel, then pointing Jimmy toward the passenger seat. The message was as clear as it was necessary. The fight was draining Jimmy, and the mission could not afford a drained driver. A wave of profound relief, tinged with shame, washed over Jimmy. He gave a tight, I can, grateful nod, his hands reluctantly loosening their death grip. He guided the shuddering truck as far to the side of the road as he dared, the tires sinking deep into the mire. The transfer was awkward, a clumsy ballet in the confined space of the cab as they swapped seats, the truck groaning and shifting beneath them in the mud. As Jimmy collapsed into the passenger seat, the full weight of his exhaustion crashed down upon him. Every muscle felt liquid and spent, his shoulders a landscape of pure pain. Sam settled behind the wheel, his hands taking hold with a different kind of authority. They were not clenched, but firm. His touch on the pedals more nuanced, his movements economical. He did not fight the skids. He anticipated them, guiding the truck through the mud with a series of small, precise corrections, using the momentum of the slides to his advantage. It was the difference between a brawler and a fencer. The truck still slithered and protested, but under Sam's control, its movements felt less like a rebellion and more like a difficult but manageable dance. Jimmy watched, his body throbbing with fatigue, as Sam navigated the liquid hell with a calm, unshakable competence. In that moment, the cab was more than a shelter from the storm. It was a testament to their partnership, a seamless transfer of responsibility that ensured the mission and the men within it would endure. The rain continued its assault, the mud its greedy grasp, but they were moving forward again, a team forged in the fire of shared strain. Their bond, the one solid thing in a world, turned to soup. The relentless, grinding struggle through the mud had given way to a hard-won, cautious pace, the road slowly firming as the torrential rain eased to a persistent, miserable drizzle. The convoy had stretched itself thin, gaps widening between the mud-spattered trucks as each driver fought his own private battle for traction and control. It was in one of these gaps, on a long, straight stretch flanked by sodden fields, that the next crisis announced itself. Up ahead, a truck that had been laboring just within their line of sight suddenly belched a cloud of thick black smoke from its exhaust. Its engine note, a steady drone moments before, fractured into a series of violent, metallic clatters that echoed across the quiet landscape. Then, with a final, shuddering gasp, it coasted to a dead stop, its bulk slewed diagonally across the narrow road, an impassable barricade of stalled steel. The blockage was instantaneous and absolute. Jimmy eased their GMC to a halt, the line of trucks behind them quickly stacking up like a metal accordion. A chorus of frustrated horns blared, their angry notes swallowed by the damp air. This was not the controlled stop of a checkpoint, or the cautious halt for an enemy threat. This was a chaotic, unplanned failure, a sudden clot in the artery of the supply line. The immobile truck was more than an inconvenience. It was a target, a beacon of vulnerability, and a thief of the precious, dwindling time they could not afford to lose. But the response was as swift as the breakdown was sudden. From the opposite direction, a small, boxy vehicle emerged, its sides emblazoned with the red ball and the white-painted letters of the Mechanics Corps. It skidded to a halt behind the disabled GMC, and two soldiers in grease-blackened coveralls leapt out before the engine had even died. They moved with the brisk, unpanicked efficiency of men for whom this was a daily sacrament. One immediately popped the hood, disappearing into the engine bay, while the other began assessing the truck's position on the road, his eyes calculating the angles of push. The lead mechanic's head emerged from under the hood, his hand making a sharp, beckoning gesture toward the growing crowd of drivers who had gathered around the scene. His shout was clear and commanding over the idle of a dozen engines. "We need weight off the front axle and muscle on the bumper now." It was not a request, but an order from a different kind of officer, one whose authority was the wrench in his hand. Jimmy and Sam exchanged a single glance, a silent agreement passing between them, and joined the stream of other drivers moving toward the stricken vehicle. Their shoulders found a place alongside others on the cold, wet metal of the front bumper. The mud sucked at their boots, the drizzle plastered their hair to their foreheads. The mechanic called out a rhythm, heave, and heave. And they threw their collective weight against the immense inertia of the truck. Muscles strained, boots slipped and scrambled for purchase in the churned earth, and grunts of effort were torn from their lips. It was a primal physical act, a stark contrast to the complex machinery that had failed. For a few intense minutes, there were no ranks, no units, only a single, grunting, shoving organism, united by a common purpose. With a final, concerted surge, the dead weight of the Pare truck began to move, its tires sliding through the mud until it was clear of the roadway, pushed onto the soft shoulder where the mechanics could work unimpeded. As they stepped back, panting, their uniforms smeared with mud and grease, Jimmy watched the mechanics already swarming over the engine, their hands a blur of diagnostic probing and swift repairs. The entire operation, from breakdown to clearance, had taken less than 10 minutes. There was no fanfare, no commiseration. The lead mechanic simply waved the convoy forward, his attention already fully returned to the ailing engine. As Jimmy and Sam climbed back into their own cab and rejoined the slowly moving line, the lesson of the moment settled over them, as clear as the Red Bull sign they passed. On the Red Bull Express, individual failure was inevitable. Tires blew, engines faltered, fuel ran low. But the system was designed to absorb those failures. Quick action and seamless teamwork were the antibodies that fought the infection of delay, the relentless collective effort that kept the lifeblood of the convoy and the army it sustained flowing forward against all odds. The very air began to change, thickening with a new and potent electricity that had nothing to do with the weather. The pastoral quiet of the French hinterlands, with its scarred fields and silent, watchful forests, was being systematically overwritten by the machinery of war. The first sign was the low, earth-trembling grumble that undercut the familiar rumble of their own engine, a deeper, more menacing vibration that spoke of immense, concentrated power. Then they saw them, columns of Sherman tanks, their long barrels pointing east like accusing fingers, parked in fields just off the road or rumbling along parallel tracks, their green steel flanks caked in dried mud. They were no longer passing the ghosts of past battles. They were driving into the beating present heart of one. The density of military traffic increased exponentially. Their convoy was no longer a solitary snake winding through the countryside, but a single thread being woven into a vast, complex tapestry of movement. Troop carriers, their backs filled with haggard-looking infantrymen who watched the supply trucks pass with hollow, hopeful eyes, jostled for space on the road. Jeeps darted between the larger vehicles like frantic water bugs, carrying officers with maps and grim expressions. The roadside itself was no longer empty. It was dotted with artillery emplacements. The long, sleek barrels of howitzers dug into pits, their crews pausing in their work to watch the fuel trucks roll by. Every soldier, every vehicle, every gun was pointed in the same direction, all of them part of the same immense, straining effort to push forward. A palpable energy, a current of fierce, desperate hope, began to course through the cab of the GMC. They were close. After all the miles, the fog, the breakdowns, the terrifying stops and starts, they could feel the front lines like a physical presence, a wall of tension and violence just over the next ridge. The abstract dots on a map had solidified into the very real, olive-drab reality of Patton's Third Army. An army that was waiting, right now, for what they carried in their truck. Jimmy felt the weariness that had settled deep into his bones begin to burn away, replaced by a surge of adrenaline so pure and potent. It was like a second wind. His hands, which had ached for hours, now felt strong and sure on the steering wheel. His focus, which had been worn thin by the long, grinding ordeal, sharpened to a razor's edge. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the chaotic road with a new intensity, navigating the increased traffic not with frustration, but with a sense of shared, urgent purpose. Every truck they passed, every tank they saw, was a confirmation. The fuel gauge still hovered perilously low. The mud still clung to the tires, but none of that mattered as much as this single, electrifying truth. They were almost there. The finish line was no longer a distant dream, but a scent on the wind, a vibration in the earth, a gathering storm of American steel just ahead, and he drove toward it now with every ounce of his being. The urgency of their mission fueling him as surely as the gasoline and the jerrycans fueled the war machine they had come to feed. The hope that had flared so brightly at the sight of the gathering army was immediately tempered by the brutal reality of its proximity. The deep, guttural grumble of tanks was now underscored by a sharper, more violent punctuation, the shriek of incoming artillery and the ground-shaking crump of its impact. They were driving into the zone where the supply line ended and the killing began. The road ahead was no longer just scarred by old battles. It was actively being torn apart. Fresh, raw craters pocked the landscape, some still smoldering, their edges littered with blackened earth and shattered stone. The air itself tasted of cordite and churned soil, a gritty, metallic flavor that coated the tongue and stung the eyes. Jimmy's driving became a desperate, zigzagging dance with death. He wrenched the heavy wheel left and right, guiding the GMC on a slalom course around the gaping wounds in the earth. Each crater was a potential grave, each near miss a jolt of terror that electrified his already frayed nerves. The truck swayed violently, its suspension groaning in protest, the jerrycans in the back sloshing and clanging in a frantic percussion. He could no longer follow a steady line. The road was a suggestion, not a path, and survival depended on reading its newest, most terrible imperfections in the split second before the tires found them. Then the world turned to fire and thunder. An artillery shell, meant for the tanks or the troops nearby, found its mark 100 yards to their left. The explosion was not a sound, but a physical force. A concussive wall of air that slammed into the awe, side of the GMC like a giant's fist. The truck was lifted and shoved sideways, its tires skittering across the broken pavement. The windshield, already webbed with 1,000 fine cracks from vibration and debris, starred into a milky cataract. For a heart-stopping moment, Jimmy was blind and deaf, his world reduced to the shriek of tortured metal and the sensation of weightlessness. The steering wheel was a live thing, bucking in his hands, fighting him for control. Somehow, through instinct more than skill, he kept the truck from flipping. It crashed back onto all 6 wheels with a jarring impact that rattled their teeth and sent a shower of tools and loose gear clattering around the cab. The engine miraculously did not stall. It roared, a sound of pure mechanical defiance. Smoke and the smell of scorched earth filled the air, and through the fractured windshield, Jimmy could see a plume of black dirt and debris still raining down around them. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine, and his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at Sam, whose face was pale, a thin trickle of blood running from a cut on his forehead where it struck the dashboard. Sam met his gaze, his eyes wide, and gave a single, sharp nod. They were alive. The truck was running. The primal, screaming fear that had erupted with the explosion did not vanish, but it was immediately buried, smothered under the crushing, imperative weight of their purpose. The need to deliver was no longer a mission objective. It was a biological drive as essential as breath. The fear was a luxury they could not afford, a distraction that could kill them as surely as the next shell. Jimmy's hands, which had trembled a moment before, now steadied, his grip on the wheel becoming an iron clamp. He shoved the gear shift forward and stamped on the accelerator. The GMC surged ahead, weaving through the fresh carnage, its battered body and cracked windshield a testament to its refusal to die. They drove on, not in spite of the fear, but through it, their focus telescoped down to the single, non-negotiable task of getting the fuel to its destination. The final stretch was a gauntlet of fire, and they were running it, their cargo of sloshing hope more vital than their own pounding hearts. The final turn was not marked by a red ball sign, but by a profound and sudden shift in the landscape of war. The shell-pocked fields and smoldering ruins gave way to a sprawling, organized chaos of a different kind. A vast, muddy clearing, teeming with a purpose so urgent it felt like a physical force. This was the forward supply depot for Patton's Third Army, the raw bleeding edge of the Allied advance. The air, thick with the smells of diesel, damp earth and sweat, vibrated with the roar of generators and the shouted commands of NCOs, whose voices were frayed down to the nerve. Lines of trucks, identical to their own, were being swarmed by teams of grimy, exhausted-looking soldiers. Their movements a blur of practiced efficiency as they stripped the vehicles of their precious cargo. Jimmy guided their battered GMC into a space indicated by a weaving sergeant, the truck's tires sinking into the churned, greasy mud with a final, weary sigh. The engine coughed and fell silent, and in the sudden quiet, the immense fatigue of the entire journey crashed over him like a wave. It was a deep cellular exhaustion that settled into the marrow of his bones, a heavy cloak woven from miles of tension, fear, and relentless concentration. His hands, still curled in a phantom grip around the steering wheel, ached with a dull, persistent throb. Every muscle protested as he pushed the door open and stepped down into the mire, his boots making a thick, sucking sound. He and Sam moved to the back of the truck on legs that felt like lead, their movements slow and deliberate. The task of unloading the jerrycans, which had once been a grounding ritual at the start of their journey, now felt Herculean. Each sloshing container seemed to have doubled in weight, their metal handles biting into their raw, blistered palms. They fell into a rhythm, a weary, wordless ballet of lift, pivot, and pass, their bodies moving with the last of their reserves. The mud clung to their boots, trying to claim them, but they pushed on, can after can, their world narrowing to the short, brutal distance between the truck bed and the growing stack on the ground. As they worked, other soldiers from the depot noticed their arrival. A group of tankers, their coveralls stained with grease and their faces hollowed by lack of sleep, paused in their work on a nearby Sherman. One of them, a corporal with a thick beard and tired eyes, caught Jimmy's gaze. He didn't speak, but simply raised a grimy hand, his fingers forming a slow, deliberate circle of approval. Another soldier, carrying a crate of rations, gave a low, appreciative whistle as he passed. "About damn time that got here," he muttered, but there was no malice in his tone, only a profound, bone-deep gratitude. These men, the very ones who would use the fuel to drive forward into the German lines, looked at the growing pile of jerrycans, not as inanimate objects, but as the difference between life and death, between stalemate and victory. That gratitude, silent and spoken, washed over Jimmy, seeping into the cracks of his exhaustion. The fear of the journey, the frustration of the delays, the cold terror of the artillery blasted, all began to recede, burned away by a sudden, incandescent surge of pride. He was no longer just a driver from Chicago, a cog in a vast, impersonal machine. He was Corporal Jimmy Carter, and he had delivered. He had navigated the gauntlet, conquered the obstacles, and brought the lifeblood of the army through hell to its destination. As he lifted the last jerrycan from the truck, his muscles screaming in protest, he set it down with a sense of finality that was more profound than any fatigue. The empty truck bed was a canvas of accomplishment, and the simple, grateful nod from a weary tanker was a medal more valuable than any ribbon. The delivery was made. The empty truck stood as a silent, hollowed-out shell, its purpose fulfilled, its cargo now a growing mountain of jerrycans that gleamed dully in the overcast light. But the journey of the fuel was not over. It was merely entering its final, most vital phase. Teams of soldiers, their movements fueled by a frantic urgency, descended upon the stacked containers. They worked with a synchronized, almost violent efficiency, prying off caps and connecting hoses, transforming the individual cans into a single flowing river of gasoline. The air, already thick with the smells of mud and exhaust, grew heavy with the sharp, volatile scent of raw fuel, a perfume of potential energy that promised movement and violence. This river of gasoline was then funneled into the waiting steel beasts. The Sherman tanks, which had stood silent and imposing, now came alive as the lifeblood of the Third Army coursed into their tanks. The process was not quiet. The guttural roar of the fuel pumps competed with the shouted commands and the ever-present thump of distant artillery. Then, one by one, the tank engines themselves roared to life. It was a sound of raw, unleashed power, a deep-throated bellow that shook the very ground and vibrated in Jimmy's chest. Each ignition was a starting pistol for the next phase of the war, a mechanical war cry that signaled an end to waiting and a beginning of the advance. All around the depot, the atmosphere transformed from one of organized receipt to one of imminent departure. Tank commanders, their faces set in grim masks of determination, hauled themselves up into their turrets. Crews scrambled over the steel hulls, performing last-minute checks, their hands moving over treads and hatches with practiced speed. The great machines began to stir, their tracks churning the deep mud as they maneuvered into formation. The ground trembled with their collective power, a low, constant earthquake of American industrial might. preparing to roll east toward the enemy. The fuel was no longer a promise. It was kinetic energy. It was motion. It was the sharpened tip of the spear. Jimmy and Sam stood together by their empty truck, two insignificant figures on the edge of this awakening storm. They were coated in grime, their bodies aching with a fatigue so deep it felt permanent, their ears still ringing from the journey's many traumas. But as they watched the tanks begin to rumble forward, a profound and silent communication passed between them. Sam turned his head, his eyes, red-rimmed with exhaustion, meeting Jimmy's. There was no smile, no triumphant shout. Instead, there was a look of deep, unshakable understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the trials they had endured and the role they had played in this moment. It was a look that contained the foggy dawns, the mechanical panics, the terror of the narrow bridge, and the blinding concussive fear of the final stretch. In that single, shared glance was the entirety of their accomplishment. They had not fired a shot, they had not charged a trench, but they had conquered their own private war of distance and dread. They had been the artery, and now the heart was beating strong, pumping its fury toward the front. The roaring engines and the advancing tanks were not just Patton's victory. They were, in some small, essential part, theirs as well. They had played their part, and as the steel tide began to flow past them, the weight of their empty truck felt lighter than air, a testament to a burden successfully carried and a victory, however small, hard won and delivered. The silence was the first thing Jimmy noticed, a profound and startling void, where the engine's roar had lived for so long. It was a silence that felt heavy, sacred, and utterly alien. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his hands resting on the cool, inert plastic of the steering wheel, his body still thrumming with the ghost of vibration from hundreds of miles of constant motion. The cab, which had been their world, their fortress, and their prison, was now just a quiet, grimy shell, its purpose extinguished. The scent of gasoline and damp wool filled the air, a familiar perfume that was now the smell of a finished task. He finally pushed the door open, the creak of the hinge unnaturally loud in the hush. His legs nearly buckled as his boots sank into the churned mud of the depot. The exhaustion was not just in his muscles. It was a spiritual weight, a leaden fatigue that had settled into the very core of his being. He and Sam found a relatively dry patch of ground near a stack of empty crates and simply sat, their backs against the rough wood, their bodies sagging with the release of days of pent-up tension. They were surrounded by the organized chaos of the forward base, but for the first time they were observers, not participants. The urgency was no longer theirs to carry. With his eyes closed, Jimmy let the journey unspool behind his eyelids. It was not a linear memory, but a cascade of sensations and emotions. The cold knot of fear in his stomach upon receiving his orders. The overwhelming scale of the Normandy depot, a city of pure motion. The bone-deep weariness of loading jerrycans under a gray sky. He felt again the white-knuckled terror of the blackout drive, his heart a frantic bird against his ribs, every shadow a potential enemy. The frustrating, infuriating delay at the MP checkpoint, the minutes feeling like stolen treasures. The cold, sharp spike of panic when the engine sputtered and died on that dark, lonely road, and the profound, warming relief when Private Davis's mechanic's truck had emerged from the gloom like a miracle. He remembered the blinding, suffocating whiteness of the foggy dawn, navigating by Sam's voice alone, the tether of trust in a formless void. The chilling crack of distant gunfire, and the tense, interminable wait in the cab, waiting for an ambush that never came. The simple, profound gift of an apple from a girl named Marie, a moment of pure humanity that had momentarily lifted the heavy shroud of war. The grinding, desperate dread as the fuel gauge needle sank into the red, each mile a prayer against an empty tank, the heart-stopping terror of the narrow bridge, the groaning engine, and the dizzying drop to the river below. The sheer physical battle against the rain and mud, his muscles screaming in protest until Sam took the wheel. And finally, the concussive blast of the artillery shell, the world turning to fire and thunder, and the grim, determined drive through it all. But woven through the fear and the hardship were other threads, brighter and stronger. The easy camaraderie of the other drivers at the depot, sharing stories that made his own fears feel smaller. Sam's slow, Alabama drawl, telling a ridiculous story about a mule named Jasper, a lifeline of humor in a grim landscape. The unspoken trust as they swapped seats in the pouring rain, a seamless transfer of a shared burden. The collective, grunting effort to push a broken-down truck from the road, a moment where ranks dissolved into shared purpose. The look in Sam's eyes after the artillery blast, a silent communication of survival and resolve. He had been afraid, yes, terrified more times than he could count. But he had not been alone. The bonds formed in the crucible of that journey, with Sam, with the mechanics, with the other drivers felt more solid and more real than the steel of the truck itself. He was not the same boy who had left Chicago. He had been hollowed out by fear and built back up by camaraderie, his spirit scarred but immeasurably stronger, transformed not just by the challenges, but by the moments of profound kindness and shared humanity that had carried him through. The return to their base camp was a journey through a world turned upside down. The frantic energy of the outbound trip was gone, replaced by a weary, almost somber quiet that hung over the returning convoys. The trucks, once proud and laden with purpose, now rattled back empty, their drivers slumped in their seats, their faces etched with the grime and exhaustion of their ordeal. The landscape, which had been a terrifying gauntlet of potential ambushes and obstacles, now seemed strangely passive, a scarred backdrop to a trial they had already survived. Jimmy watched it all slide past the window, but his eyes no longer scanned the hedgerows for threats or the sky for enemy planes. He saw it now with the detached gaze of a veteran, the immediacy of the danger replaced by the deep, resonant echo of memory. Back at the familiar mud and canvas of their home depot, a different atmosphere awaited them. The organized chaos of loading had been replaced by the quieter, more methodical rituals of maintenance and repair. Mechanics swarmed over the returning trucks, their hoses and wrenches tending to the wounds of the journey, but there was a new current running beneath the usual routine, a buzz of excited conversation that cut through the fatigue. Reports were filtering back, passed from driver to driver, from sergeant to private, moving through the camp like a rising tide. Patton's Third Army, fueled and furious, was on the move again. The great offensive, so perilously close to stalling, had been reignited. Towns with unpronounceable names were being liberated. German lines were buckling under the renewed pressure of the American advance. The lifeline had held, and the heart was beating strong. Sergeant Miller found them as they were refilling their canteens at the water trailer. He looked them over, his sharp eyes taking in their gaunt faces, their mud-stained uniforms, the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much. But his usual grim expression was softened by something that looked almost like respect. He didn't offer a long speech or empty praise. Instead, he placed a firm hand on Jimmy's shoulder, a grip solid and affirming. He did the same to Sam, his gaze holding each of theirs for a moment. "You delivered," he said, his voice low and gravelly. You got it through. That's what matters.